Hello, boxing fans and non-boxing fans. If you've clicked on this video, it's more likely that you're the former. But if you are in the latter category, i.e., you're someone who doesn't really follow the sport of boxing, but perhaps you're interested in this video, you could be a UFC fan, or you could be a fan of another martial arts, or even a totally different sport. I just want to share my thoughts on this notion that's been going around for the past few years that boxing is in decline. It's a notion that we see from boxing pundits, occasionally from fighters themselves, and from a number of fans. And I reject this notion, and I want to explain why in this video. Boxing is a very old sport. Its origins can go back to ancient Greece and the ancient Olympics. The modern sport, that is to say, the sport as it has developed to what we know today, is still pretty old. It goes back to late 17th century Britain. Um, and it was codified under the Marquess of Queensberry rules in 1867, again in Britain. So this is a very well established sport with a very long history, far longer than MMA. Um, so the consensus is, or there is a consensus out there, that in the last sort of 20 years, 15, 20 years, MMA, mixed martial arts, has sort of surpassed boxing. Now, I would concede that MMA has galvanized a lot of interest. I would concede that perhaps in some areas they have marketed their sport in a better way. I'm a boxing fan, I'm not an MMA fan. And that's not that I have any disrespect towards MMA fighters, but I just don't follow it. So I'm a boxing man myself. It's a sport I've followed for years. But let's break this down a little bit. This idea that boxing is in decline, part of it is aimed at the heavyweight division. And I think part of the reason for that is because the Klitschko brothers were so dominant for so long. And as great as they were, I think it did bring a slightly boring, predictable aspect to the heavyweight division. But it must have felt a bit like that in the late 50s or the mid 50s when Rocky Marciano was so dominant. The fact of the matter is, in boxing, there is always up and down waves in terms of where the sport is popular. Now, I would argue the past decade has been something of a golden era for the welterweights, an era that we haven't seen since the 80s. I mean, if we think of the 1980s, we think of great welterweights and middleweights like Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Tommy Hearns, Roberto Duran, um, Wilfred Benitez. Now look at the 2000s and the 2010s: Manny Pacquiao, Floyd Mayweather Jr., Tim Bradley, Canelo Alvarez, Gennady Golovkin, and there's others. So in every era, you get great fighters. I don't understand the cynicism about this era. You could say that in the heavyweight division it was because of the dominance of the Klitschko's, but now Vlad Klitschko's retired. Um, in terms of popularity, I would argue the sport is as popular as ever if the footfall is anything to go by. I mean, look at the sum of the fights that we've seen in recent years. Look at Joshua versus Klitschko, 90,000 people. There hasn't been a boxing attendance like that since probably since the 1930s. The 1930s. Even in the golden era of the 70s, none of Ali's fights had numbers like that. I mean, if nothing else, that proves that there is still a strong interest in the heavyweight division. I just don't accept there's a decline. I don't see where that comes from. And not only was that a big footfall, but it was actually a great fight. Most people who were there, and from the commentary I've seen, most people put that as one of the greatest heavyweight fights of all time. Not the greatest, certainly probably the greatest British heavyweight or fight to be held in the UK. But yeah, I think most people watching that would say it's in the top 10, top 20 heavyweight clashes of all time. But not just that, you get non-title fights that really, people say that was a hell of a fight, like Derek Chisora versus Dillian White, Anthony Joshua versus Dillian White for that matter. That was a title fight, but You get also not just within the heavyweight division, you get, if we look at the middleweight division recently, Canelo Alvarez, Gennady Golovkin, a real war. Granted, it was a disappointing result, but the fight itself was a very stellar fight. So people who say that boxing is boring these days, I don't know what they're talking about. You can find any number of great fights in any given year, and in every generation, you have skilled, talented, and yeah, occasionally great fighters. So I get a bit irritated when I see pundits who frankly should know better constantly riding down this sport, running down this sport, saying, oh, boxing's in decline. No, it's not. I mean, come on, look, even in the Klitschko era, you had 50,000 people turning out to his fights in Germany, 90,000 people at Klitschko Joshua, 80,000 people at Carl Froch, George Groves too. I mean, those are numbers that speak for themselves. So I just don't buy this argument that boxing is in decline. There are things about the sport that I don't like, and I would concede damage the sport. I think, for example, the fact that there are five or so different governing bodies is a problem, but I don't think it's fair to blame the fighters for that. A fighter can only be expected to do his best. It's not his fault that there's different governing bodies that broke away from each other in the mid 80s. You know, all he can do is do his best. I don't think I think it's wrong to blame fighters for that. The only way they can kind of prove themselves is to unify the divisions. Perhaps if boxing is to really reform in one way, it would be to get some unifying governing body. I don't see it happening anytime soon. There's other things I don't like about the sport. There is corruption. There's no point denying it at Olympic level, and unfortunately at professional level. There's too many examples of guys who are tested positive for some drugs and then nothing changes in terms of the rankings. I think if this sport is to have rules, then it should really impose them. That's my own feeling. I also think that there's certain attitudes from fans. I've covered this before that I don't like when when fans call fighters bums and tomato cans and all that sort of crap. I have no time for that. I don't like that. I think it's disrespectful. But to be honest, it's always been there. I'm not so naive to think this is a new thing. It's always been there. I don't like it. I think that fans should have fundamental respect for the men who step between the ropes, whoever they are, whether they are a journeyman, so called, or a champion. But I just don't agree that you can make a sweeping statement like boxing is rubbish these days. Sometimes I see comments on old fight videos from the 80s or the 70s, people saying things like, this is what boxing used to be, real warriors going at it. Well, you can see plenty of examples of that these days. You know, you see plenty of guys who give their all. Um, and the strange thing is, when people watch those fights, they give these fighters credit, but then they seem to forget it. Boxing fans seem to have a very short memory, and I find that rather irritating. But frankly, you know, when I look at pundits and when I see the covers of certain boxing magazines, sometimes it looks like they're just being cynical for the sake of it. Pundits have a responsibility to keep this sport in the, you know, it's their job as boxing journalists to write up the sport. Now, I'm not saying they should be dishonest. If they are genuinely critical of something, they have a right to their opinion. But when it's constantly critical, then it starts to give the impression they're just running down the sport that they're supposed to be advocating. Um, so I just don't accept that boxing is in decline. You get plenty of examples of great fights. You get plenty of examples of courage. You get plenty of examples of really good performances. And one last point, this thing about fighters running, it's something that's been thrown at Mayweather many times. So here's my take, right? Mayweather as a person, I've not much time for him. I think he's arrogant. I think he's braggadocious. I don't like the way he flaunts his wealth. As a fighter, no one could dispute he is absolutely incredible. Now, this thing about running, if you want to see a street fight, go down to your local pub and see two guys get into a brawl. Floyd Mayweather is a professional boxer. Okay, he's not a slugger, he's not a brawler, he's a professional boxer. So when people accuse him of running, I don't think they understand what boxing is about. It's not about a street fight. It's about protect yourself at all times. And I accept that's not the most exciting form of fighting, but Mayweather, you know, contradicted that in the McGregor fight. which was by all accounts a great bout. So as much as I don't particularly like Mayweather's personality, when people disrespect him as a fighter, I think it's nonsense. Floyd Mayweather is a phenomenon. Floyd Mayweather is one of the greatest fighters of all time, and we should respect that fact. So anyway, I'll leave it there. But basically, I don't believe this sport is in decline. There are things I don't like in the sport boxing. There are things I think can improve. But let's not say it's in decline. It's not. I don't think it ever will be. There's been points in the past where you could say, oh, it's been in decline. And sometimes it's been through tragedy. Maybe a guy's died in the ring or there's been serious injuries. This is a dangerous sport. But even in those occasions, boxing's pulled through, and so long as there's an interest, I think there's going to be, and so long as there's free will, this sport's going to endure. It's like no other sport. As much as there's things I dislike about it, there's some very compelling aspects about this as well. It tests men in a way that is, I should say, it tests people in a way that is absolutely unparalleled in probably any other sport. MMA, no disrespect to those guys, it's also a martial art, but I do think boxing is unique, and I don't believe it is in decline.